Hey everybody, it's time for our next segment of our class on apologetics, being able to give a defense for what we believe. And one of the ways in which we oftentimes need to do that is in answering this question about pain and suffering and evil and why do those things exist. Having an answer for that question can go a long way in helping you address the concerns of your neighbors, of your family, of those who would call your faith into question. Because this is probably one of the, not only one of the most prevalent questions that's going to get asked of you as a Christian, but it is probably also one of the most important questions for people to be asking of you since you are a Christian. This is a very real concern that a lot of people have, is how do you match what we believe to be a good and wonderful God with a not so good and wonderful world? All you got to do is look around at the world around you, and you could listen to this lesson this week with all of the race war and the race conversations going on. Or you could listen to this lesson a year from now, and there will be something else going on that is causing pain and suffering in our world. That is a very clear picture of evil in our world. And because it exists all the time, everywhere you go, this is a real question. It's a real concern that people have had for many, many years. And so it's good for us to dig into this question. Why is there pain and suffering and evil? The proposed problem is, if God is all-powerful, he could end evil, pain, and suffering. He could. And we don't disagree with that statement. God is absolutely powerful enough to end evil, pain, and suffering. And so the second premise is that if God is all good, he would end evil, pain, and suffering. And you're going to find that that's where I take some disagreement with this logical thought progression. And so the conclusion is evil, pain, and suffering exist, therefore God does not. If God could, and if God would, but God hasn't, well then that means there is no God. And I understand the premise behind that. It is based off of, first of all, a certain understanding of who God is. And then secondly, it's based off of a certain understanding of what God would do. And I have no doubt whatsoever that God is all-powerful and that God is all good. Our disagreement is not in who God is. And our disagreement is not with those who would question this, that evil, pain, and suffering exist. Our disagreement is what we define as good behavior or good decision making is not necessarily the same decisions that an all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowledgeable God would do. And so that's where we're going to run into some changes here. I think it's missing a premise here that, of course, we'll talk about, which is if God is all-knowledgeable and we are not all knowledgeable, we have to be careful about making the assumption about what God would do. I think you'll see what I mean before we're done in the next 10-15 minutes. So the reality is evil, pain, and suffering exist. Evil exists. It has existed for all of our lifetimes, for the generations that have come before us. Evil has always existed. Even when the earth was created, there is evil that exists because there is a devil that is working against God in some way. We know that pain exists. We've all suffered pain. We've all experienced it. We've all dealt with it. And whether we're talking about physical pain or emotional pain, we've all experienced the difficulty of pain. And suffering exists. All of these three things exist, and I don't know that any of us would really be arguing the truth of those statements. We know that those things exist. We know that those are things that people have to deal with, have to fight with. We know that everybody knows that these three things are in the world. Now, there are some who might define evil differently than we do because we look at it from a spiritual perspective. But we tend to even see the lack of character, the lack of goodness in certain historical figures, and therefore even those who aren't necessarily faith-based people will argue that those who have done such atrocities in our world are truly evil. I've heard that word tossed around a lot right now, even in the current climate of George Floyd and the police officer and what he did to George Floyd. And you get a lot of people who will make arguments about whether that police officer was evil or not. There's a lot of those kind of discussions that happen because the world tends to universally accept that these three things are realities. And therefore, they are things that we can understand are true things. Now, before we get into the answer, we do have to at least make a couple of understandings or a couple of ideas and principles. For instance, man has free will. And we won't necessarily look at all these passages because we don't have time in this video, but I do encourage you to write them down. Maybe we'll get a chance to look at them during our discussion on Wednesday night. But man has free will. God created man with free will. And you see that being a big part of our just creation process and what God's plan was for us as his people. God wanted us to be people who exercise free will. Joshua, it's supposed to say 24. Joshua 24 verse 15 is one example of us exercising free will, where Joshua says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." That's Joshua making that decision. No one's making that decision for him. We are those who exercise free will. Another principle we have to understand is that God is not a chooser of person. He does not choose or favor one person over another. That's very much Matthew 5:45. He calls us to rain to fall on the just and the unjust. And then very bluntly it's said over in Acts 10 that he is not a respecter of persons. He does not choose one person over the other. And so those two principles, I think, are very important for us to recognize as we dig into what does it mean, these particular questions, and how do you find answers. So the reason I point those out is because I think we need to recognize that evil, pain, and suffering could exist not because God has placed those things there, although we're going to talk about that more in just a moment, but rather because when man has free will and God is not necessarily making things perfect for some people and imperfect for other people, God is not choosing some for his blessing and then others to not have his blessing. God is not the one making that choice. Man is the one making that choice because of his free will. And so that leads us to trying to figure out where this pain and suffering come from. Well, there's a lot of different options for us as we discuss that. One is past generations. The Bible talks often about the consequences of sin passing down from generation to generation, not the guilt of sin. We're all guilty for our own sin. We're all judged for our own sin, but the consequences of sin, the pain and suffering that come from sin, can pass down from generation to generation. Our own mistakes can cause us pain and suffering. And I don't necessarily mean spiritual mistakes here, but I mean we make mistakes. When I miss the nail with my hammer and I hit my thumb instead, that was my own mistake that caused my pain. Now I can also be holding a nail for my child and he missed the nail, at which point that becomes his mistake. But it is mistakes oftentimes that cause us pain and suffering. Our own selfishness can often cause us pain and suffering. I see that often being the case when there is pain and suffering in a marriage relationship. The violating of natural laws can cause pain and suffering. Meaning when we go against the way our world works. If I were to say, you know what, I think I feel like flying today, and I jump off the back deck, well, those natural laws are going to cause me pain and suffering because of my mistake. The result of personal sin can bring pain and suffering. If I choose sin, over God's way of righteousness, I can suffer pain and suffering, the results of other people's sins. I think that's important to recognize because we have a tendency sometimes to tell people that, if they just didn't do the things that they were doing, then they'd be fine. We sound sometimes like Job's friends, where they sat there with Job going, well, you're guilty. You have to be guilty because you're suffering. Well, sometimes it's not our own sin that causes us pain, but it can be other people's sin that can cause us pain. Sometimes it's just circumstances that are outside of our control, and there's really no rhyme or reason for it. It's just what happens. If a tornado tears through my neighborhood and plows down my house and causes me a lot of loss and maybe even the loss of loved ones, well, those are circumstances that are just out of my control. It's pain and suffering as a result of circumstances. What about sources of evil? Because that seems to be maybe on a different level. What are the things that cause evil to exist? Well, one is it's a consequence of our free will. If you look again in the Sermon on the Mount, over in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it. Well, there's a choice there. I can choose the narrow way or I can choose the broad way, but some of my choices are going to lead to evil results and some of my choices are going to lead to positive results. And that's all just a consequence of free will. Sometimes I think we can blame the devil when we see evil going on in the world around us, or we're experiencing evil in our own lives. 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, the one who commits sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God was revealed for this purpose, to destroy the devil's works. And so again, you've got the idea of the devil being involved in the suffering of evil, the suffering of evil things happening to us. To add to that, I think we have to accept the concept that there is a compliance by God when we experience evil. If you think back at the story of Job in chapters 1 and 2, you've got that story revealed where the devil, or the adversary there, and we believe that's referring to Satan, to the devil, that the adversary is presenting himself before God, and there's that little competition that happens between God and the devil when God says, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in all the earth. Well, God allows the devil to go and punish Job, or cause Job suffering, cause evil to happen to Job. And so Job loses his livelihood, he loses his home, he loses his children, he loses his servants, he loses his flocks and his herds. He loses everything. And then later in chapter 2, we find Job loses even his health. And all of that happens because of the devil. But be careful that you're not excusing God out of the scenario. God is compliant in what Job is suffering. God is involved in what is happening to Job. And I think it's important for us to recognize that for a couple of reasons. One is it allows us to see that when God says there's nothing that'll be thrown at you that you can't handle, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to man, but that God provides you a way of escape. The reason God can so easily provide us a way of escape is because God knows what the devil's doing. In that case, in Job, the devil had to come and get permission from God in order to do what he did to Job, and God set limits on the devil's ability to do bad things to Job. You see the same thing over in the Gospels when Jesus tells Peter, the devil has demanded permission to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you all. And so there you've got again an instance in which the devil gets permission from God in order to do evil things to God's people. And God is compliant in those things. I'm not in any way implicating God or saying that God is guilty of evil. Not at all. You'll see that before the end of the lesson. But I do think that God not only allows evil to happen, but is even compliant when the devil does evil, because it can serve the purposes, the righteous purposes of God, as it does in the case of Job. When you consider other passages like Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 7, notice this: I form light and create darkness. I make success and create disaster. I am the Lord who does all these things. Now, your version, if you're using a King James version, will say, I make victory and I create evil. The word there for disaster or for evil are the same word. That God has a role in allowing or even creating evil, and he does it because it has a good purpose. I think you'll see what I mean if you'll be patient with me and allow me to get through the rest of these couple of slides. So, part of the reason that God allows evil is because it reveals God as the solution to evil. Luke 19 verse 10 says that the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which is lost. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 54 through 57 talks about God's victory over death, God's victory over evil, which he accomplished through the resurrection of Jesus. Now let me ask you, could we have the death and resurrection of Jesus, which brings about the salvation of our souls, had God not been compliant in those things happening? Had God not even had a plan for those things to happen? God knew that Jesus would experience death as a result of the need for him to overcome sin. The question is, could God have overcome sin if he did not allow evil? I would argue he couldn't. We know that we are the solution to evil. Again, that should say Matthew 28. But that's that great commission that we often quote and we often think about, where we are told to go out into all the world and preach the gospel to all creatures. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and remember I'm with you always to the end of the age. That our process in evangelism is part of the solution to evil, because we go out in there and we tell people how God has overcome evil. But God, because of his foreknowledge, because of his power, because of his goodness, he is the one who has allowed evil to happen in the first place. And the reason that becomes important is because only by allowing things to take their course could God bring about through that course the solution to evil, the complete solution to evil. As far as pain and suffering, what's the solution to pain and suffering? Well, God's the solution to evil, but there is no solution to pain and suffering. I know that sounds depressing, but pain and suffering can be an important identifier that brings about good results. Pain is a catalyst for change. It allows us to seek change. It allows us to seek something that is better than here, better than life, better than earth, better than our existence that we have right now. God does not end pain and suffering, even though he could, but God recognizes that there is a greater purpose, a greater good that comes from us suffering on occasion. It allows us to not become so attached to this world. It allows us to be able to do a lot of good things, which we'll talk about in just a moment. God doesn't end it because it serves the purpose he has of exalting us to his kingdom. And that's the real goal that God has through the scripture, that we become his again, that we become united with him again. We're only going to do that if we're not so content with this world. So why doesn't God end it? Well, look at the benefits that come from experiencing pain and suffering. It creates in us the ability to help others. It creates a dependency on God. It creates a dependency on God's people. It displays God's love in us whenever we suffer, because we can see how God cares for us through that. It increases character in each one of us. It teaches us perspective. It brings us an eternal perspective. It demonstrates our Christ-likeness because we're willing to suffer for others. It creates in us a longing for heaven. Here's the most important thing to remember. God has also suffered. We talk about pain and suffering as if that is merely an earthly reality, but it is not. God placed himself into a position of suffering so that he could deal with evil, both Jesus suffering on our behalf, hanging on the tree, and God suffering as he watched his son suffer. God chose to suffer so that it would benefit you and me. As much as we hate evil, pain, and suffering, as much as we don't like the fact that those are realities in our world, that doesn't change the fact that it is also a reality that God himself has faced. And he faced it for our benefit. There's a passage over in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14 through 16. It says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need." We often complain about evil, pain, and suffering, but it is nothing that God hasn't first experienced himself. He has experienced evil, pain, and suffering. He has experienced the temptations of this life. He has experienced the evil that is possible. He has watched from an eternal perspective exactly what damage has been done by our flippancy, by our lack of understanding, by our willingness to sin so easily. And so while we sit around and we complain about pain and suffering, that a good God would never allow that, he would not only allow it, but he would suffer himself for us so that we can have a benefit, a great solution to the problem of evil. The solution is turn to God. And a great eventual solution to pain and suffering when we escape this world and we go to where we belong, we go home. We go to the place where suffering no longer exists. What a great God we have who's willing to allow that.